In this section, we will learn about file I/O in Python. First, we will learn about obtaining user input in Python. Next, we will learn about the basic concepts for working with files that are used in computing, so that we can understand the terminology used in this section of the course. After that, we will learn about using the open and close functions to open and close files using Python code. Then we will learn how to use Python's getcwd function to get the current working directory. Next, we will learn about the mkdir and chdir functions. mkdir allows us to create a directory or a folder using Python code. chdr allows us to change the current working directory using Python code. After that, we will learn about the rename and remove functions that Python gives us to rename and remove files respectively. Then we will learn how to use read, readline, and readlines to read data from a file. Next, we will learn how to either write text to or append text to a file using the different file modes that Python allows us to open files in. Finally, we will look at a recap of what we learned in this section of the course. In the next lecture, we will learn about obtaining user input in Python. In this lecture, we will learn about obtaining user input using Python's input function. When writing computer programs that are interactive, like video games, it is important that we are able to obtain user input and respond to it in the program. For example, if the user presses an arrow key, we want to move the game character in that direction. Other keyboard keys may be mapped to actions such as attacks that the player can use in the game. To get user input in Python, we can use Python's input function. The input function takes in one parameter, which is the prompt to show the user. Let's look at a basic example of working with Python's input function. First, we will create a variable named user input and set it equal to the input function with the string please type something passed in. Then we will use Python's print function to print out what the user typed. We can pass in a string user typed and then concatenate the user input to it. Let's run the code. In the console, you will notice that the prompt is printed. We can actually start typing anything we want, and our input will be shown in green. Once we are done typing, we can hit the enter key. Then we will see our input that we typed to the console. The input function converts whatever the user types to a string, and then prints it out as a string. If we want to take in another type of input, for example an integer, we need to specifically do the conversion on our end. For this next example, we will ask the user to enter a number. Then we can print out the number multiplied by 2. To do this, we need to use the int function to cast the input string to an integer, and then multiply it by 2. When we run the code, you will be prompted to enter a number. Once we do, and hit enter, you will notice that the number was doubled, and the result was printed to the console. In the next lecture, we will discuss some of the basic concepts that we will use when working with files. In this lecture, we will discuss some of the basic concepts that we will use when working with files. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept of a file. Each of us has files on our computer. But what exactly is a file? More specifically, did you ever think about how the computer stores a file and remembers all of the data inside of it? A file is a sequence of bytes stored in memory. Recall that a byte is 8 bits that are either 1 or 0. So really a file is just a sequence of ones and zeros that the computer can translate into human-readable information. A text file contains a sequence of characters that are encoded using some encoding like ASCII or UTF-8. Files like images or audio files are called binary files. They are just a sequence of bytes with no encoding. The file system on our computer organizes files and lets us create, access, and modify files. Files are grouped together into directories. Directory is just a fancy word for folder. The folder at the top of the hierarchy is called the root directory. There are 3 steps to processing a file: open the file, read from or write to the file, and close the file. In the next lecture, we will learn how to open and close files. In this lecture, we will learn about opening and closing files in Python. In Python, we can open a file using the open function. There are several different modes that we can open files in. 3 of the main modes for opening a file are opening a file for reading, writing, or appending. To open a file in read mode, we use the open function and pass in the file name as the first argument and R as the second argument. R stands for read mode and is the default mode to open a file in. For example, if we use the open function and just pass in the file name, but no mode, the read mode will be used by default. Read mode will allow us to read or examine the contents of the file, but not modify them. There is also a write mode, which we can signify by passing a W in as the second argument to the open function. When we write to a file, It will wipe the existing contents of the file and replace it with the new text that we specify. If we want to add to the text that is in the file, instead of replacing it, we can open the file in append mode. This is done by passing in a as the second argument of the open function. In coming lectures, we're going to learn some functions for how we can read from and write to files, but this lecture is just about the basics of opening and closing them. Once we are finished working with a file, it is important that we close it. To close a file, we can use Python's close function. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's getcwd function. In this lecture, we will learn about Python's getcwd function. If you're familiar with working with the command line, this function might sound familiar, and that is because it is a terminal command to get the current working directory. CWD stands for current working directory, and getcwd lets us get the current working directory. What exactly is the current working directory? This is where the program currently resides and executes in our file system. The first step to using this function is to import the OS module. Up at the top of our program, we will import the OS module by typing import OS. Now we can use the getcwd function to get the current working directory. We will print out os.getcwd. When we run the code, you will notice that a file path on our computer was printed out. Currently, if we create files on our computer, they are stored at that location. The next question is how to change this location, and that is a question that will be answered in the next lecture, so stay tuned. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's mkdir and chdr functions.